Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing this great conference. So much of the material that I'm going to be drawing on today comes from my most recent book, which came out in September with Routledge, The Early Wittgenstein on Metaphysics, Natural Science, Language and Value. And my aim today is to compare Wittgenstein's early treatment of induction and causation as it emerges in his first published book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Now, in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein discusses induction and causation alongside each other in two separate sections. The first section is a primarily negative section in which he criticizes one particular understanding of induction and causation as turning on a notion that I'm calling the notion of natural necessity. And then in the second section, in the second of these sections, he engages in a more positive discussion of induction and causation as part of a broader discussion of scientific representational systems. Now, for today's talk, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the first negative discussion, but I will say some things about the positive treatment towards the end of the talk. Now, by inductive thinking and language, I mean, as we know something, I mean the procedure whereby we derive, on the basis of experience of past facts, conclusions concerning future facts. So, for instance, in the past, I may have observed or experienced that the flame melted the wax, and on the basis of this past experience, I conclude that therefore, in the future, the flame will melt the wax. Causal thinking and language are closely related to inductive thinking and language, but are distinct from them. And by causal language, I'm going to mean propositions. I'm going to mean here propositions of the type, the flame causes the wax to melt, or the magnet causes the iron pin to move. And it is causal language in particular that Wittgenstein associates with physics in the Tractatus. So I'll say a little bit more about that later on in the talk. Now, in the first negative section of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein criticizes one particular understanding of causation and induction, which emerges as part of what I'm calling the natural necessity view. Now, in this view, inductive and causal thinking involve a form of inference or entailment that has at its heart this particular notion of natural necessity. And in particular, in this view of induction and causation involve this idea of a natural necessary entailment, whereby a proposition Q necessarily entails proposition P by virtue of certain facts of nature. So the idea here is that if Q obtains, it is impossible for P not to obtain, and that this is so not by virtue of any internal or analytic or conceptual relations between propositions P and Q, but by virtue of the fact that a particular law of nature obtains in reality. This is the view. And it is part of the natural necessity view that Wittgenstein is going to criticize. It's part of this view that the fact that the law obtains is meant to justify or ground the relation of natural entailment. So the purpose of the law, or the role that the law plays, is one of justification or grounding. So how does this pan out in the cases of induction and causation? Well, first of all, the case of inductive inference. We might be talking, for example, of an example as follows. If the flame has melted the wax in the past, then in this view, the idea would be that necessarily the flame will melt the wax in the future. And this by virtue of the obtaining of a particular law of nature, for example, the law of uniformity of nature. In the case of causal inference, the idea would be that if the magnet causes the iron pin to move, what we are saying in this view is that if the magnet is present, then necessarily the iron pin moves. And this again by virtue of the obtaining, as a matter of fact, of a particular law of nature, for example, the causal law of action at a distance. Now, it's worth saying something about the relation between this notion of natural entailment that I've just introduced and the ordinary logical notion of entailment. Because in the case of the ordinary logical operation of entailment, we find that necessity only arises when we are dealing with propositions that are internally or conceptually related to each other. So for example, if we're talking about the combined proposition, if Alex is a bachelor, Alex is a man, then this proposition is necessarily true in that by virtue of the fact of by virtue of the internal relations that hold between the constituent propositions. It is by virtue of the fact that a bachelor is an unmarried man, by virtue of that conceptual connection, that if Alex is a bachelor, Alex is a man, is necessarily true. So this is a case in which necessity arises by virtue of the internal relations between the propositions. And again, in the case of ordinary logical entailment, we find that when propositions are not internally related to each other, their combination generates logical contingency. So for example, in the case of the proposition, if it rains, there is a traffic jam, we're dealing with two constituent propositions that are not internally related to each other. And as a result, we get a result that is sometimes true, sometimes false. If it rains, sometimes there is a traffic jam, but sometimes mysteriously there isn't. And I've never been able to work out why. So this is the way in which logical entailment works. In the case of logical entailment, typically necessity arises as a result of internal relations between propositions, and if not, we get contingent results. Now, natural entailment, the notion of entailment that arises as part of the natural necessity view that Wittgenstein is going to be criticizing, proposes something quite different, because in this view, it is possible for necessary relations or necessary truth to arise between propositions that are not internally related. So for example, in the example of if the magnet is present, the iron pin moves, the idea, according to the natural necessity view, would be that if the relevant law of nature does indeed obtain as a matter of fact in reality, then there is going to be a necessitating connection there, and this combined proposition is going to be necessarily true. So the natural necessity view introduces a notion of necessity and of entailment that is different from the ordinary logical ones. So when the natural necessity view is at work, the idea would be that when we're dealing with two propositions that are not internally related to each other, what results from their combination is going to depend on whether or not a certain law of nature obtains in reality. So if we take the example of if the magnet is present, the iron pin moves, we might find that when the law of nature does not obtain, their combination is going to, when the law of nature does not obtain, it is a logical entailment that applies, and the combination of this and the combined proposition is going to be contingently true. And when the relevant law of nature does obtain, it is natural entailment that applies, and the combined proposition is going to be necessarily true in this natural sense. And this, in fact, is a very important aspect of the natural necessity view. It is very important to the credibility of this view that natural entailment does not purport to replace logical entailment, but just purports to restrict its application. So the idea is very much here that advocates of the natural necessity view are not suggesting that we should overhaul our ordinary logical practice, or that we should altogether replace it with something else. They're just suggesting that for a restricted set of propositions, the ones that are governed by certain laws of nature, then in certain circumstances, namely if the relevant laws do indeed obtain, we're going to find relations of natural entailment instead of ordinary logical entailment. So this purported compatibility with logic is, I suggest, according to Wittgenstein, key to the very credibility of the natural necessity view, in that if the natural necessity view was requiring of us that we altogether overhaul our thinking and linguistic practices and do something completely different, then its appeal would be far lesser. It is this purported compatibility with it that renders it, on the surface, attractive. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in that first negative section of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein criticizes the natural necessity view. And I just want to give you an overview of what the shape of that discussion is going to look like. So Wittgenstein is going to start off by noting that logic pervades all of our thinking and language about the world. So it's an integral part of all of our thinking and speaking about the world. Then he's going to move on to the idea that natural necessity is actually not compatible with logic, and that suggesting that it is, in fact, results in nonsense. It's going to be one of the ideas that I'm going to discuss in a moment. And then the next move is going to be to suggest that if the natural necessity view was presenting us with an alternative to ordinary logical practice, then it would simply lose its credibility. So the idea is, by the end of this process, we should simply no longer be tempted by the natural necessity view. So let's consider this idea that logic pervades the world, which is actually a sentence that Wittgenstein uses in the midst of a different discussion in Tractatus 5.61. Now, the idea that I want to pick up on here is very much the idea that the application of logical operations is actually our bread and butter in terms of thinking and language. So it is an integral part of all the thinking and language that we do about the world in a really ordinary respect, both in everyday language and in the language of the natural sciences. And he also suggests that the application of logical operations is such that, and this is a quote, there can never be surprises in logic. And then later on, he suggests that in logic, process and result are equivalent, hence the absence of surprise. Now, the idea that I want to pick up from that, there is a lot to be said about those two remarks from the Tractatus, but the idea that I want to pick up on here has to do with the following, that according to Wittgenstein, knowing how to apply a logical operation does not depend on knowing what facts happen to obtain in reality. When I am looking at two propositions and thinking about combining them together in a particular manner, knowing how to do that and knowing what would ensue if I did this, that, and the other, that process is one that cannot depend on my already having established in advance facts about facts that obtain in reality. And part of the reason for this is that, according to Wittgenstein, the application of logical operations depends exclusively on the internal structure of the propositions involved, and it has to be like this. This is why I am able to apply logical operations to propositions simply by attending to the internal structure of the propositions without having to refer to what is actually going on out there in empirical reality, or in reality. Now, Wittgenstein suggests that once we have noted this, it becomes evident that the natural necessity view is in fact incompatible with ordinary logical practice. If the natural necessity view were in place, we would in fact need to know what facts obtain before we could decide which operations apply in particular cases. So if the natural necessity view were in place, then when Q and P are not internally related, we would, and we wanted to combine them into a more complex proposition. For example, say that we are looking at the proposition, if the magnet is present, then the iron pin moves. Right? And we're trying to establish what notion of entailment is at work there. If the natural necessity view were in place, then presumably, if the relevant law of nature failed to obtain, we could safely ascertain that the relation that applies in this case is the ordinary relation of logical entailment. But if the relevant law of nature obtained, then it would be natural entailment that would apply. And then the supposed truth table would look quite different. It would be truth table C, which is tautological. So if the natural necessity view were in place, we would not be able to proceed with our ordinary logical practice as we do, in that we would need to be able to establish certain facts before we knew which operations applied to certain propositions in some circumstances. And I think that part of the worry here is that once we have allowed this through the door, then really we are going to have to start asking ourselves these types of questions about all of the propositions that we're looking at, potentially. How do I know when I am thinking of when I'm thinking of combining two propositions, whether or not there is some law that governs them, if the law does indeed obtain? Now, one has to be a bit careful about what precisely it is that Wittgenstein is suggesting here. Because in my view, Wittgenstein is not suggesting either that there can only be logical necessity, which would be a restrictive metaphysical claim, potentially metaphysical claim, but certainly a restrictive one. Nor is he suggesting that we must always apply operations to propositions as we ordinarily do in logic. The emphasis is not actually on either of these two ideas. So in my view, Wittgenstein is not here pushing a form of restrictive metaphysics or a form of dogmatic logicism, at least not in these remarks, not in his discussion of natural necessity. Instead, his aim is to draw our attention to a central feature of our ordinary logical practice, and to the fact that the natural necessity view, if it were in place, would actually replace and not merely restrict it. Now, insofar as the natural necessity view draws its credibility from its purported compatibility with ordinary logic, whereas in fact it's not genuinely compatible with it, it is actually, it would supply a replacement for it. Insofar as this is the case, the natural necessity view subverts itself, and this self-subversion generates nonsense. If, on the other hand, the natural necessity view presented itself squarely as proposing an alternative to ordinary logical practice, then it would in fact be far less enticing and credible. And I think the suggestion is that we would simply not be tempted by it. So the question is, what remains once the natural necessity view has dissolved, according to Wittgenstein? Now, I think that in some quite important respects, the Tractatus does not aim to be revisionary here. Indeed, Wittgenstein suggests in the Tractatus that everyday and scientific language are in perfect logical order, so there is nothing really that we need to tamper with there. Instead, I would suggest that, in his view, the natural necessity view is generated by traditional metaphysical philosophy and by scientism, possibly coming from other sources. It is not actually part of everyday and scientific practice. So the suggestion coming from the Tractatus is that we need a non-natural necessity understanding of scientific laws, of induction, and of causation, one that better reflects actual practice and one that does not end up subverting itself when credible, or when attempting to be credible. And so I am now moving to the positive discussion in the Tractatus. So I'll just say briefly a few things about it. The first thing to say is that Wittgenstein's starting point in his more positive section has to do with the idea that it is a mistake to view laws as justifying necessarily entailment or justifying inferences generally. So according to Wittgenstein, the purpose or the role of a law or of a principle is simply not that of justifying or grounding anything, let alone relations of natural entailment. Instead, he suggests a law is an instruction within a particular optional scientific system for the construction of propositions. I'll give an example in a second. But the idea here is that scientific systems are optional. We can opt for one or the other, but that they are nevertheless connected to the facts. So we don't randomly choose what system to subscribe to. We evaluate the usefulness of a system against a background of facts that is going to include psychological facts about human beings, for example. So what is the upshot of this for causation and induction in particular in the Tractatus? So the idea is that, for example, causal laws, which Wittgenstein very much associates explicitly with physics in the Tractatus. His view is going to be that causal laws, for example, the law of causal action at a distance, should be regarded as an instruction that rules in the construction of certain propositions within that system. So, for example, the law of causal action at a distance rules in the construction of the proposition, the magnet causes the iron pin to move. If we were dealing with a scientific system that did not include this law, or if we were dealing with a scientific system that ruled out action at a distance, then this particular proposition, the magnet causes the iron pin to move, would be ruled out from that system. So laws in scientific systems are instructions that rule in or out the construction of particular propositions within those systems. And indeed, Wittgenstein suggests that it is the sign of a law being at work that our construction of propositions is constrained. In fact, it is precisely because it is a sign of a law being at work that our construction of propositions is constrained, that, in his view, there is no such thing as a law of induction. Now, let me explain this point just very briefly. Imagine that all of the swans that you have come across in the past were white, right? And that you then, for the first time, come across a black creature that looks very much like a swan. Okay. Now, at that point, you're going to have to make a decision whether or not to call that creature a swan. And that decision is going to be based on to what extent this creature resembles swans in the past and whether those resemblances matter, etc., etc. There's going to be a process there. But the idea is that the fact that there is a decision to be made, the fact that you are not constrained, shows that there is no such thing as a law of induction at work. So one of the crucial differences that Wittgenstein is going to extract between causation, the case of causation and the case of induction in the Tractatus is that causal laws act as proper laws inside scientific systems, but there is no such thing as a law of induction playing a similar role. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Very clear talk. Good time for questions. So, sir.
Thanks very much. Very interesting. I was just slightly puzzled though by the sort of grounds you attributed to Wittgenstein in the Tractatus for rejecting the natural necessity view, and there are kind of two reasons I was slightly puzzled. The first one is it seems slightly at odds with what he says in that section in the Tractatus where he's rejecting the view. So, if I recall correctly, what he says is the existence, like a causal nexus, which one would need to justify such an inference. The kind of natural necessity inference doesn't exist, and so those are his grounds for rejecting the idea that there is some kind of entailment here. So it would seem to me that the idea is more of the kind of thing he said it wasn't, where he's rejecting the idea that there is some other kind of necessity apart from logical necessity. And then the second reason I was slightly puzzled by it is I'm not sure the grounds which he did attribute to him really work, because as far as I can see, the sort of the truth table of the natural entailment operation is the same as the ordinary logical implication. So, you know, so it's the same truth operation on the base propositions. It's just we're ruling out a certain line in the truth table. So I don't. Yeah, it's not clear to me that you do have to know that a certain fact obtained in order to be able to understand what's being meant by such a proposition.
Okay, I'll start with the second, if I may. It's very important that we're ruling out that second line, because the point is that I ought to know, without needing to consult the facts, whether or not it makes sense for me to be thinking in terms of Q is false and P is true. The idea that I may need to check the facts in order to be able to determine whether that applies or not is already hindering the process. That already means that I am actually no longer doing logic as we know it. Well, I'm no longer doing thinking as we know it would be, or language as we know it. In connection to your first point, I wasn't quite sure what the objection was there. Do you think that he endorses natural necessity?
No, I don't think he endorses it, but I was just wondering why you thought his grounds for rejecting it were the grounds of Tejedor rather than rather than his rejection of any other type of necessity apart from logical necessity, because he's very clear about that. He said it later, after this section, that there is only logical necessity. So he hasn't kind of said it yet, but the grounds he does give in that section is that there's no causal nexus which will justify such an inference. You can kind of see that as saying, you know, there is no type of necessity of the kind we need here. So, at least, like, on a textual basis, it would seem the rejection of any other kind of necessity apart from logical necessity was his grounds for rejecting the natural necessity view rather than the grounds attributed to it.
Thank you. That's a very good question. So it's part of my view that in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein is using a very particular method, and the method consists in putting to us sentences that he's inviting us to consider from different perspectives, and that so he's presenting us with sentences and surrounding them with other sentences and other discussions with a view to achieving a particular effect. Now, I agree that perhaps just from looking at those sections, we may not be able to reach the conclusion that I'm suggesting we ought to reach. But that is a conclusion that comes out very clearly, I think, if one then considers other things that are happening in the Tractatus, and in particular, the repeated treatment of various positions within metaphysics. And when one has seen that, and one revisits a sentence like, there is only logical necessity, it just simply becomes to me incredible to interpret it in a manner that would suggest that Wittgenstein is telling us, look, I am restricting necessity to only logical necessity, because that would be a substantive, restrictive, metaphysical claim.
Okay. So, questions back here.
Thanks. So this relates to the thing you just said now, and you said in the talk as well. So when he says the only necessity is logical necessity, so that's not meant to be a statement of a necessary fact. Presumably it's not a statement of a contingent. So is it that it's a conceptual remark? And I mean, is it a proposition?
Thank you. So I think that is a sentence that is there for a particular effect, and the effect is the effect of getting us to think through a series of steps. And the first step might involve thinking, this natural necessity business is different from logical necessity. What's that all about? But then the continuation of that process would involve us coming to realize that the natural necessity view is just not credible if it's presented as a replacement or an alternative or a rival for ordinary logical practice. So that's the sentence, there is only logical necessity. One of the effects that it's meant to have is to get us to see that there is a self-subverting process happening in the natural necessity view.
So when you say outside of logic everything is accident, is that the same point sort of made from the other side, or is that a new point?
The part of the problem is that I don't think that we can just clarify the purpose of sentences like that in the Tractatus in isolation. They need to be seen as part of broader discussions. Yeah.
On this side, then I'll get the gentleman here. Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. I now understand a lot more about how Wittgenstein views logical necessity in relation to natural necessity. But I'm coming from my own perspective, I'm thinking that there might be other forms of necessity. So, for example, historical necessity. And what I'm suggesting is that there might be something in Hegel's idea that truth does not reside primarily in language and propositions, but resides primarily in relations and things. And that these relations and things can be seen historically, so that the necessity is not given in terms of a prediction of what's going to happen, but is given in terms of things being structured, relations and things being structured in such a way that certain things can happen and other things can't happen. Now, I'm thinking that Ludwig might have benefited from helping himself to that idea, because I'm thinking that it might have helped him to clarify more the relationship between logical necessity and natural necessity, if there are also other forms of necessity. I'm sorry if I'm not making myself very clear. But you know, if there are historical reasons why certain things can happen and other things can't happen, then that seems to me to be another way of looking at necessity, which Wittgenstein hasn't considered.
But would the idea of historical necessity that you mentioned there, would that be a variety of causal necessity? I mean, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure that it would be that causal necessity. It might be causal necessity, but it might be that by looking into the way things are done in the past, we see certain structures in history, and we surmise that these structures, that some of these structures are still present, and that they limit what can happen within reality. So that's not quite causality, but it's some sort of limitation of what can happen.
Okay, so if the idea were, for instance, that we say that the suggestion was that we ought to actually come up with a set of instructions that constrains the way we think and speak about the world on the basis of past experience, for example. And if we were very clear as to the idea that what we're doing is setting up an instruction for the construction of propositions within a particular system, that would be a form of constraint. But Wittgenstein would not want to call it necessity. But it would be a form of internal constraint, internal to a particular system. And I can't think of a reason why he would in principle be opposed to that. And in fact, I don't think he would see his business to oppose or endorse such an idea. I think he would think, well, it's up to the historians or natural scientists or etc. to decide whether there is a purpose in coming up, in having a system that works like that.
Okay, yes, this is the last question. Thank you.
If the purpose of the law is an instruction within a system for generating propositions, are Popperian propositions aimed at breaking that system?
Tractarian propositions.
Popperian.
Also Popperian?
Yeah.
I don't know enough. Tell me a bit more about Popperian propositions.
Just this idea that you aim to try and make a proposal or a hypothesis which stands outside of your known, see if you can break the paradigm that you're working with.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's very interesting. So how would those work?
Do you want to consider that over tea or something?
Yes.
I mean, it
Yes.
might be a bit more of a
But it would be quite nice to then unify
Yes, it was
kinds of
interesting.
propositions between
Yeah.
Wittgenstein and Popper, where
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
Or you can imagine a good ding dong of an argument over that.
yeah.
Yes, it is.
Right, Chon, can we thank Chon for translating?